Only a couple of chapters left in our book, Grandad's Wheelies. This chapter's called Building a Wheelbarrow and Betting a Sewing Machine. Granny, did you and Grandad really fish up the North and the South Islands? Which one did your grandfather say he pulled up? Granny asked, sifting the flour into a bowl. The North Island. And he reckoned he pulled it up first before I pulled up the South Island? Yes. He knows very well that I pulled up the South Island first and he was pulling up the North Island afterwards. That man doesn't have an original idea in his head. Granny worked some butter into the flour with her fingertips. What did you use for bait? Some gravy beef left over from a stew that we ate the night before. Your grandfather used a worm out of his old smelly compost heap. The flour has gone like breadcrumbs. I said, I bet I know what you're making. How much do you bet? Mum gave me 50 cents, but I spent it. On lollies? I was silent. Just as well. Your mother will give me what ho if she finds out I've been encouraging you to bet. Granny shook her head. You can wash your hands and chop these dates in half for me. Mind you don't go cutting yourself. There'll be a couple of spare pennies in my purse behind the clock on the mantelpiece. We could use them to bet against each other. Granny, did you use your false teeth for the hook? Granny was mixing in the chopped dates now, but she turned and stared at me. She stuck her fingers into her mouth and pulled back her lips and bared her teeth. I squawked and ran back down the garden. What did your grandmother say? Asked Grandad. She reckons she pulled up the South Island before you caught the North Island, and I asked her if she used her false teeth for a hook, and she went, grrr, and she said you don't have an original idea in your head. Grandad, what happened to your old dinghy after you and Grandma pulled up the New Zealand? We just made it back into the beach before it was swamped. I had to build a new dinghy. What happened to the old one? I needed a wheelbarrow to build the road from Auckland to Wellington, so some of the planks out of the old dinghy went into that. The anchor I melted down in the incinerator and made it into the wheel, and the oars I used to make the handles. What was left over I used to build our old dunny. Does Granny know that? Never told her. Grandad took a shovel and I ran back up the house. Gosh, he's a telltale, isn't he? Did you know Grandad's wheelbarrow was made out of his old dinghy? He melted down the anchor to make the wheel and made the oars into handles, and what was left over he used to build your old dunny. Nonsense. Granny was sprinkling flour on the bench and rolling out her mixture, thick with dates. He lost his dinghy gambling with that harum-scarum friend of his, that wicked old Mr. Humdrum. What did they bet on? Who could catch the biggest snapper? Your grandfather caught one so big he tried to pull it into the boat and it pulled him over the side instead. That wicked old Mr. Humdrum grabbed your grandfather's feet and the big snapper pulled him overboard too. They both grabbed hold of the dinghy, but the big snapper pulled it under and the pair of them had to swim to Takapau Beach from out in the Rangitoto Channel. Well, that must have taken them a while. Not when you're being chased by a giant snapper with its mouth wide open and all its teeth showing. Granny opened her mouth and snapped her teeth at me. And that's how Grandad lost his dinghy. Yeah, but he likes to tell everyone he built his wheelbarrow out of it. I knew Granny was going to cut the flour and date mixture into squares and put them on a baking tray. Boy, I said, running back down the garden. Just in time, Grandad said, handing me the bucket. Plant the seed potatoes in the furrows with the shoots pointing up, and I'll come along behind and shovel in the dirt. Grandad, Granny said it's not true you built your wheelbarrow out of your old dinghy. She says you lost it in a bet with Mr. Humdrum. Your grandmother's the one who bet on everything. She gambled away our fortune on the Melbourne Cup, remember? She even lost her sewing machine on a bet. Grandad was catching up, so I went faster, planting a spud with the shoots pointing up, taking one step and then planting another one. She bet Mrs. Humdrum, her good singer sewing machine, that she could make up a better fish story than mine. Your grandmother's never forgiven me for winning, but she was the one who betted away her sewing machine. And whose fault is that? Yours? I thought you'd say that. Grandad filled in the last of the furrow. That's the spuds planted. What say we go and bet your mother or Bob grandmother or Bob that she won't make us a cup of tea? And I said, what say we bet her 10 cents she won't give us a date scone, hot out of the oven? Grandad nodded. She'll fall for that, I bet, he said.